Sorry.
Okay, no problem. Thank you very much. And I apologize for not being able to contribute to the discussion in French. My French is very poorly. So I appreciate the work of the translators here. First of all, as I said, it's really difficult to get a clear and accurate picture of climate finance provided overall. There are definitional issues. There are issues with the self-categorization by OECD countries. There is a lack of transparency, accuracy, and comparability of data collection and sources. And it's also very difficult to get a regional breakdown for quantity and quality. And quality, this is the important part of climate finance provided, meaning financial instruments, the localization of climate finance, private sector activities, and domestic categorization. Nevertheless, when you look at different data sources, and I looked at the OECD, the work of the Climate Policy Institute, UNEP, and UNFCCC, which has a couple of climate finance related reports coming forward, you see some overall global trends, which I believe are applicable to Africa as well. That includes that in both public and climate finance provision, adaptation finance continues to lag behind. The balance of allocation is off. According to the OECD figures for 2018, of the 79 billion total climate finance provided and mobilized by developed countries, only 21% were for adaptation, 69% were for mitigation. We see an overall increase of cross-cutting finance, particularly led by the GCF, and we will hear about that, and the Global Environment Facility. We see a decreasing concessionality of finance provided. According to the OECD, between 2013 and 2018, the share of finance provided as loans has doubled. The share of grants has decreased to 20%, and this also includes financing for the LDCs, including African LDCs, and the concessionality of climate finance provided to the multilateral development banks, which are increasingly important, was particularly low. They only provided about 9% of their climate finance as grants. And this obviously in times of increasing level of indebtedness, the lack of fiscal space that means for countries in times of Corona and other crises to pursue other priorities is crucial. And this is why dedicated climate finance instruments, dedicated climate funds are so important, and particularly for Africa and particularly for African LDCs because of the concessional finance and grant finance provided. Now, if you look at the slides that you see here, then you see that according to the OECD, Africa as a region received about 25% or 17.3 billion, roughly on average per year between 2016 and 2018. You see also the regional differentiation within Africa, but how does this compare with needs? By some estimates, Africa would need 7 to 15 billion per year to enhance adaptation, and a full 3 trillion to fully implement NDCs. Some more breakdown numbers here by the African NDC Hub and the African Development Bank are provided. I want to point out that those include projected costs for loss and damaged. And this is really relevant because that indicates that developed countries are tracking their feet not once, but twice. First, in failing to reduce their own emissions, and second, in not being generous enough in providing adaptation finance. When we look at the next slide, this is just meant to give you a brief overview of the climate finance architecture. I want to focus on some of the dedicated multilateral climate funds. Those are the ones here that are shown in green, and those are the ones that are tracked by Climate Funds Update, which is a joint operation with the Overseas Development Institute that the Heinrich Böll Foundation in Washington, D.C. has been undertaking for about 10 years. When you look at this slide, you can see actually, unfortunately, I don't have time to go into the numbers, but you can see the progression in cumulative funding received in Sub-Saharan Africa over time. By 2020, the cumulative amount received for countries in Sub-Saharan Africa from tracked multilateral climate funds by the climate funds update was roughly 6 billion. And then when you look at the next slide and the map here, when you include North African countries, with especially Egypt and Morocco receiving a very large share of tracked finance by climate funds update, then you get to a total of 7.248 billion. Again, this is cumulative. It also shows very clear difference in how much climate finance is received, with, for example, South Africa receiving more than any other African country so far. And that's largely for some large-scale mitigation projects under the Clean Technology Fund. However, multilateral climate funds have focused their finance in least developed countries within sub-Saharan Africa. Since 2003, 29 least developed countries have been supported with 3.8 billion, which represents about 64% of the finance tracked by CFU. Ethiopia, Democratic Republic of Congo, Zambia, Burkina Faso, Tanzania, and Mozambique are all least developed countries due to receive more than 200 million for approved project activities under CFU tracked funds. And I just want to point out, and we will hear from a GCF speaker, that in 2020, the GCF accounted for 27% of cumulative project approvals for sub-Saharan Africa least developed countries, surpassing even the least developed countries fund. If you look really quickly at themes, and I know we are running out of time, they are also the progression of funds tracked by CFU. You see that in contrast to other regions in Africa, the financing provided for adaptation is the largest share. However, even though the adaptation needs in Africa are clearly gigantic, mitigation finance provided, or finance for emissions reduction, is still quite large, particularly if you add up mitigation and financing for REDD+ activities. And this is also a global trend, you see an increasing share. We are now in 2020 by 17% of cross-cutting climate finance, which goes with a dip in the adaptation, pure adaptation financing. And I think this is also that we are seeing specifically in the region as something to follow. This one, the bubble graph, actually shows you the importance of dedicated multilateral climate funds and their finance provision for sub-Saharan Africa. This shows how much the Green Climate Fund, since its full operationalization in 2015, has shaken up climate finance provision for Africa, particularly by increasing significantly the finance also for African least developed countries. And we'll hear more about the special allocation framework of the Green Climate Fund from Eduardo, which is supportive of that. I want to show quickly, because I think this is also very important and relevant for African climate finance, that in the climate regime overall, the recognition of the importance of gender responsive climate finance has grown. All multilateral climate funds now have gender policies, gender action plans, and require their fund recipients to pay attention to gender. This includes all the main funds that we have talked about, the GCF, the GEF with the LDCF, the Least Developed Country Fund, the Special Climate Change Fund, the Climate Investment Funds, and the Adaptation Fund. And those together cover 87% of dedicated multilateral climate finance tracked by CFU that goes to sub-Saharan Africa. Nevertheless, and we will hear more about that as well, the existence of formal mandates, and all of those funds have formal mandates, has not improved access for local groups, and in particularly women and gender groups. By some estimates, less than 10% of dedicated climate finance channeled through multilateral fund reaches the local level. Again, we will hear more about that. Several steps are necessary to change this, and this includes, for example, enhancing direct access that allows for the provision of small grants at subnational level, And funds should also, all the funds that we are talking about, should also set up small grant facilities to allow local groups and women's access, irrespective of country endorsement. And I think this is critical. Finally, one last slide. As part of the continued transparency and accountability deficits for climate finance, tracking on how gender responsive climate finance is and how locally it is provided needs to be significantly improved, including for African climate finance received or climate finance received in Africa. According to some OECD DAC self-reporting figures by contributors, only about 1/3 of climate finance projects and programs are designed to respond to gender differentiated needs. And while there is no regional data available, there is no reason to assume that this unfortunately doesn't hold true for the African continent as well. Thank you very much for the attention. I know that I probably exceeded my time. There is a lot to cover and I appreciate your interest. Thank you.
Merci. I speak in French.
Thank you. Thank you very much. You have been extremely concise and clear, as we can see on the chat, and we will be sending this presentation to everyone. That was extremely clear and brief, exactly what we needed to open the debate. And we can see here the challenges and the positive evolutions, particularly on the last point on the gender agenda, but also the difficulties. I noted a reduction in the adaptive funds for adaptation, even though this is very important that we focus on adaptation. Thank you very much for your presentation, and I hope that there will be questions later on via the chat. So the next speakers, I'm going to also ask them to be extremely brief and concise so that we can pick up the late speed. Now I'm going to ask Eduardo Freitas, who works for the Green Climate Fund and who is going to focus on the African issues, that is his specialties. Eduardo Freitas, thank you very much. My name is Eduardo Freitas. I'm from Gcf from the Green Climate Fund. I'm going to speak in English because my presentation was done in English to facilitate the understanding. I will be at your disposal in order to present you better the Green Climate Fund and the other activities.
Est-ce que ça marche bien?
C'est bon.
Can you see my screen? Yes, good. Thank you very much.
Okay.
Good.
So in the interest of time, let me go straight into the presentation. So the GCF, as you may know, has about 11 years of history, and throughout this period, and this is the key point that I wanted to share on this slide, throughout this period, the GCF has approved 177 funding requests for projects, summing up to $8.8 billion in GCF funds. And these projects have mobilized co-finance resources from our partners to the tune of $33.2 billion in total, GCF plus co-finance. 129 of these projects are already under implementation. What we call it the GCF under implementation are the projects for which we have signed specific funded activity contracts with the institutions that are receiving our funds. So the other 30 or 40 are in process of legal contractual negotiations. The GCF has approved 133 accredited institutions to receive funding for financing of their projects or programs, and our funds have reached 121 countries so far. Okay, This presentation has a few slides about the GCF. I don't really, in the interest of time, am not going to spend too much time on these. I want to show you the figures, but just to briefly let you know that the GCF employs what we call a four-pronged approach to achieving our financial objectives. These are transformational planning and programming, catalyzing climate innovation, de-risking investments to mobilize finance at scale, and we want to mainstream climate risks and opportunities into the investment decision-making processes. This slide gives you just a global view of the accredited institutions of the GCF. These are national, international, public and private sector institutions stemming from MDBs to commercial banks and so on. There's a large diversity of partners represented here. To the left column, just to reflect a little bit on very quickly on what Leanne was, I think, mentioned in her presentation. Thank you, Leanne, for citing a few of these things as well. To the left side of this slide, you would see the direct access entities, which mean the national and regional institutions that can channel GCF resources to their countries. We're happy to see this growing, and there's a lot really that we need to do to improve this network, not only in terms of numbers, but also in their capacities to channel GCF resources. GCF is a country-driven and open partnership organization that strives to achieve by mandate a balanced allocation of 50-50% of our investments between mitigation and adaptation. We have a range of instruments. I'll speak a little bit more about this in a second. And we consider ourselves a risk-taking patient capital institution. So quickly about the instruments, to the right-hand side here, you'll see that we deploy loans, equity guarantees, and grants. We want concessional pricing and tenor on the loan side. We accept relatively high risk in our investments, equity being dedicated to cover early stage or address early stage risk and enable higher mobilization of resources, tailored guarantees to catalyze resource enabling crowding in of private sector funds as well, grants whenever needed, targeted capacity building, enabling affordability, and so on. I want to jump straight into the numbers. This graphic will show you how the GCF commitments of funds have evolved, projects have evolved since 2015. You'll see that right now we are at $8.8 billion committed, 5.7 billion. This number has actually grown to 6.1. These are July figures. I'm sorry, this was updated in July, but under implementation, meaning contracted 6.1 billion and 1.9 billion have been dispersed. Now about Africa. Sorry, I'm hearing a bit of an echo. Please let me know if you're hearing an echo too. I'm hearing a loud echo on my side. Is it okay that I continue?
Yeah, you should be all right now, Eduardo. Yes.
For Africa, GCF funds totaling nearly $3.3 billion, with mobilizing 7.7 billion of co-financing for 70 approved projects, 52 of which are under implementation. The right side, you see that our African portfolio represents about 37% of the total GCF portfolio. Now, this slide will show you how much of this portfolio are funds of the GCF channeled through direct access entities. So we see that the pie is split more or less equivalently between what we see in Africa and what we see globally. In Africa, specifically, we have 18% of our funds totaling $0.59 billion channeled through direct access institutions and 16 approved projects, and 54 approved projects with the international accredited entities, totaling $2.69 billion. Now, the GCF has a project preparation facility as well, and I want to talk to you about this portfolio in Africa. For those that are not familiar with this, the project preparation facility dedicates up to $1.5 million to accredited institutions that need to beef up or to further develop their funding proposals so that they are able to be considered by the board of the GCF. And this has been very actively utilized by African institutions. So we see approvals of $12 million so far for 17 applications from 22 countries. Of the $12 million, nearly 10 have already been dispersed. And as a result of this PPF, we call this a PPF, Project Preparation Facility. As a result of the PPF, we have seen 6 funding proposals submitted, of which 3 have been approved by the board. If I'm not mistaken, in Liberia, Rwanda, and I'll check, if you're interested, I'll check the 3rd one. I skipped my mind right now. Interesting to see as well that in terms of the access type, we see majority, 40 of the institutions requesting PPF being regional or national entities. This is what the PPF instrument was conceived for, while 35% are internationals that have channeled resources through PPF to the countries. Finally, the GCF has another financial tool called the readiness support. These are grants targeted at increasing the readiness of countries and institutions, accredited or not, that need to channel finance, climate finance into the country. We have, for Africa, approved 455 readiness grants so far to the tune of $110 million. Again, this is specific to Africa. We have disbursed to 141 of these requests, a total of $52.7 million so far. In the interest of time, I'm worried about my time, but I wanted to let you know that we brought a couple of examples of projects in Africa, and we can speak perhaps during the Q&A session a little bit more about these 4 examples. I'll just quickly mention them. One is the Gcf Fund in Eastern Africa with the Acumen, an international institution, mobilizing $110 million. Senegalese project with AFD, mobilizing $80 million. Project with IUCN in Rwanda for $50 million, and an EIF, that's a national institution in Namibia, mobilizing $9.1 million. So just a few examples. I'm sorry if I went through them a bit in a rush, but I'd be happy to speak a little bit more with you later on. Thank you very much. I'll be happy to speak further. Over.
Merci, merci beaucoup. Non, mais tout ça a été absolument dans les temps. Je vous remercie.
Thank you. You were perfectly on deadline. We've been so much under time stress this morning, so we're happy to see that we're catching up. It was very clear. We'll certainly probably have questions later on. Now we are going to go towards the other side, someone who's benefiting from this program. So I will give the to Ms. Estelle Mercier, who is from the French Development Agency, who is going to speak about their experience from the French point of view. What is your impression, your remarks, or experiences to transmit to us and to these people who is very numerous? I mean, there's over 200 people sitting in front of the screen and listening to us. Thank you very much. I hope you can hear me. Great. Hello, everyone. Thank you, Mr. Soulage, for this invitation. It's a great honor to be part of this panel. I'm going to quickly tell you about the lessons learned from the French Development Agency together with the Green Climate Fund. For those who don't know, the French Development Agency is a public institution in charge of implementing the French development policy and strategy. As an introduction, I'm going to do a quick historical overview to see that we've been extremely active when the Green Climate Fund was implemented. We immediately considered it as being a strategic and structuring partner for our institution. And you need to know that our general manager, Rémi Rioux, has worked at the creation of the Green Fund within its former functions. So the AFT was one of the first accredited financiers in 2015 with the Green Climate Fund, with a high accreditation level in terms of amounts, in terms of financial instruments that can be mobilized, and also in risk taken in environmental and social risk. And since we have been able to raise more than 300 million euros for green funds for many projects and one major program. This portfolio of projects is mainly deployed in Africa and very deployed in, let me quickly quote one project which we have implemented, for which we have a $50 million co-financing of the Green Fund, which is the hydrometeorological regional project in the Indian Ocean, together with the Indian Ocean Commission and the Adapt Action funding. In the other projects, we have a focus very strong on the climate challenges for the African continent. We are working a project on energy efficiency of the buildings, solar energy, climate resilience in the Sahel region. And Africa is clearly a priority of a global strategy. So we are implementing this in our partnerships with the Green Climate Fund. So after this quick introduction, I would like to go more into detail in the lessons that we have learned from these different preparations and the implementation of projects together with the Green Fund. As everyone knows, it's not a scoop. It's not easy. It's complex to get financing from the Green Fund, even though we are seeing that the process has globally improved over the past year. It was a rocky road. Nevertheless, there's still many hurdles, many challenges. The way the Secretariat works, the processes, the procedures, all this is being done in English, which is just not necessarily easy for Francophone countries. The delays are very long. The costs are high in terms of audit and human resources, internal human resources mobilization. That is something that is pretty much everyone shares with us. But nevertheless, and this is really what I wanted to underline, we are seeing that the accreditation for the Green Fund and then the access to financing from the Green Fund implies for many institutions a deep transformation. The expectation levels are high. That forces us to raise the standards in place. We have seen this at the AFD in terms of risk management, environmental risk management, or social management, risk management. It was forced us to improve on standards and norms to take into account gender issues, rights equality between men and women, and better implement climate issues in our strategies, in our operations. For instance, define a climate criteria, indicators in order to ensure good monitoring. And at this stage, I think it's very important message is that the Green Fund is an accelerator for transformation and for integration of mainstreaming of climate issues in these institutions. And here again, the AFD, the French Development Agency, we have been leading a climate strategy for the past 10 years. The Green Fund has nevertheless taught us new things and forced us to adapt even better. I wanted to finish with another message. An important objective of the Green Fund is to reinforce the capacities of the local stakeholders in the developed countries so that they can directly access green funds without having to go via international institutions. That is something that's really in the DNA of the Green Fund ever since the beginning, and we're absolutely convinced by this mission. And we try to contribute to it via two channels. The first one is, of course, the French Development Agency. We are deploying a facility that is called adaptation, which you'll hear regularly about this during the summit. It's really targeted on the African countries, and we are monitoring us and coaching a certain number of countries in access to green funds, like in the Indian Ocean Commission, but also the APIA, the Tunisian Agricultural Development Fund. And there's another way to reinforce this institution is via the ADFC Club, International Development Finance Club, that regroups 26 development banks across the world. It's mainly national development banks. In Africa, we have the BOAD for Western Africa, TDB in Eastern Africa, and also ADBSA in Southern Africa. And 14 institutions among these members already accredited with the Green Fund. So the development banks, they play a fundamental role in the climate transition of their countries and institutions. This is a message that we're pushing, especially ever since we have created the coalition Common Finance, a coalition that brings together more than 500 development banks around the world. And all these banks represent about 10% of the world investment. So it's fairly significant. So we are absolutely convinced with this alliance that all these banks need a strong mandate, a strong green mandate from their governments, because they represent absolutely fundamental and founding stakeholders in order to have more resilient and climate change strategies. So in order to be in accordance with the Paris Agreement. So this is why we have signed a partnerships with the Green Fund that aims to reinforce the capacity of the banks of this club to get finance access in order, in the end, deploy upscaling programs. And this goes, among others, via financial contribution of the Green Fund to the Climate Club and the FDFC. It's a fascinating topic. Sadly, I cannot go too much into detail, but I think we'll have the opportunity during the second day of the Common Finance Summit in October and during the COP26 in November. We'll have opportunities to discuss all these issues and highlight the message together. I also would have some questions to add, but I just wanted to remind everyone that you can send your questions directly to the panelists via the chat, not to participate live, but you can ask the questions over the chat, and Romain is next to me, the chap with the glasses next to me, who's waving to you. He is compiling all these questions and he will pass them on to the speakers. So do not hesitate if you have any questions or comments or contributions, send them in chat. Since I think we have very good contributors and we should have time for questions and answers. Now I'm passing the microphone to, I would like to excuse I'm now asking Ms. Zainabou, sorry if I do not, Zainabou Zegda. She is the coordinator for gender issues together of the African Green Plumbers Fund. Ms. Zegda, I think you're with us. Yes. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Hello, everyone. Yes, indeed, my name is Zainabou Zegda. I come from Burkina Faso, and I have been monitoring the process of the Green Climate Fund in order to ensure the integration of gender issues in climate finance. And so after what my colleague Leanne from Washington was explaining, which when we're working very closely together with her in this process, so I'm going to quickly share a experience linked with a project that we are implementing. So I'm going to share my screen for some slides based on this project. So, it's a great honor for me to share with you this experience linked with the project. The participation in decision making. Women want to have a climate justice, gender climate justice. And so, as it's been mentioned in the introduction, and this explains why this project was put on the table. So quickly, I'm going to do a quick return on the project history and a slide on gender policy and the action plan of the Green Fund in terms of orientations and opportunities for the implementation of gender issues. Also, what we are doing concretely as civil society and as women's groups, but also across all this, we'll also see how we can find opportunities for women and for women's groups, advocacy groups. So the participation in decision making is in Africa, notably and in Asia, the fact I'm talking about the initiative of Widow and both ends, and our group is one of the regional chapters of these institutions for empowering women. It's called Women Demand Gender Fair Climate Finance. And my English-speaking from my Anglophone colleague, Mrs. Titiakosa, is the coordinator for the English-speaking Africa, and I am the coordinator for the French-speaking Africa. We have our objectives are to need to improve access to climate finance for women and local communities, for gender-sensitive projects and for climate issues. And second objective, the equitable, the just, the fair and effective participation of women rights advocates, which is precisely what justifies the establishment of the CVS Monitors network. In order to be able to follow and evaluate so I'm sorry, I have not a very good connection. I hope you can see me. I'm going to refer to some OCDE figures that how there is an issue as far as the gender aspect is concerned, despite the different you can see, for instance, that the public development aid links to climate that supports the realization of gender equality represented 31% of the bilateral APDs that was devoted to climate change in 2014. But within all that, only 3% had the gender equality as main objective, while 28% integrated gender equality as secondary issue. Again, we also see that gender equality is better integrated in adaptation activities than in mitigation activities. In 46% of bilateral only targeted gender equality, while 28% for mitigation.
We can also see, in terms of gender equality, in the sector linked to climate change, gender equality is well integrated in agriculture and water sectors, less dealt with in economic infrastructure sector. In 2013 and 14, only 88% of the aid went towards gender-targeted climate aid. So it shows it's a very masculine sector. And so this work needs to change things. In 2014, only 2% of all the climate aid, which was gender sensitive, went to Southern civil society organizations, so 2%, which represented $132 million. And when we know how great the needs are in terms of climate change, so we need to do more to improve the opportunities for women to take part in the green economy, particularly by making sure benefit equally from development projects focused on clean technologies and renewable energy.
Et ce projet, donc, je viens d'expliquer le pourquoi de ce projet.
So why this project? It was initiated by coordinated gender organizations by building capacity through webinars, Skype meetings and physical meetings, and taking part in board meetings throughout the region. So what do? We look at projects from national to international level. So before they are submitted to the Green Fund, for example, and we look particularly at the gender issues.
points. Et je
We do look
m'appelle
at other issues as well.
pour voir si des groupes de femmes avaient été associés pour s'assurer que la prise en compte de leurs préoccupations est une réalité et que également les expériences et les connaissances des femmes sont.
The experience and knowledge of women is also important in these projects.
Ceci, justement, un intérêt qui rejoint l'intérêt du Fonds vert.
And one of the interests which joins that of the Green Fund is a gender policy which recognizes that initiatives against climate change are more sustainable, fair, and efficient when gender equality is taken into account and integrated from the conception of the project to the implementation of projects, including the monitoring. And in addition, it recognizes that women in vulnerable communities are also part of the solution to climate change and should really be involved in discussions and decisions about them. So through this project, we've developed a guide, which you can find on the website WEDO, about women's rights, as well as an assessment tool for lots of gender actions, which are submitted to the Green Climate Fund. It's an annex document, and when we submit a proposal to this, assessment is made of the gender aspects. And I'm going to finish by saying that there are opportunities for women in terms of capacity building, for example, through the preparatory program, where groups of women, through this program, can obtain capacity building, obviously by going through accredited organizations. There are also groups of women who can take part actively at a national and international level, monitoring projects, the process of the Green Fund, to make sure their concerns are taken into account and to make sure women have access to climate funding. So how can we access this funding? In general, women's organizations are small organizations, but we have we see women being very active in these projects. And these women can mobilize different resources. We can also, as experts, given gender documents and documentation are requested when drawing up a project, women's groups or individuals, as experts, can take part in designing these projects. If there is a problem mobilizing stakeholders, and we're delighted in our organization to have very willing men and women, but mobilization is still an important issue, and it's difficult because it's based on volunteer work. And we need people who are willing to support this gender work, and we need them to join us so that we can strengthen our message and work towards integrating gender issues. And to finish, we have a major problem with monitoring for those projects that we've already put in place to make sure that everything that's been said about the project is actually happening in reality. So monitoring is a very important issue. So the challenge of mobilizing resources is very important, and we would like to ask on anybody who is willing to get involved. Thank you very much for your support. Thank you very much. It was very good. I just wanted to let everybody know that after the break, because we're all allowed a break, so from 3 to 4 in France, there will be a focus point on these gender issues, and we'll be looking at this in more depth. And this is at the heart of Climate Chance's work. So please don't hesitate. We have one last speaker, and we're looking at your questions in the chat. We'll have a little bit of time to deal with that because we're quite on time. So please don't hesitate to ask questions through the chat. We're here to answer those. So we have one last speaker now, Sophie de Konik, who is going to present a process called local, which deals with climate change issues at a local level. So I'm going to hand the floor to her. So it's over to you. You have 10 minutes. When you see that the screen changes, your time is over. If you see me again, it's because it's time up. It's over to you. Thank you very much. Thank you, Monsieur Soulage, and thank you to the organizers of this conference for the opportunity to share some of my experience with you, with African countries and with other regions. And maybe I could try and link this with the previous presentation. So I wanted to share some information with you about what we call a local financing mechanism. So it's a local climate adaptive living facility. Sorry, I just want to check. Yes, so the starting point of this initiative was to offer a funding mechanism for adapting at a local level.
Qui reconnaît en termes d'adaptation différentes dimensions, notamment dimensions locales et
different levels, a local and an international level. So the UNCDF, which is a UN agency specialized in PMAs, works on different types of funding mechanisms, particularly funding for local authorities and local development. So we have seen that the role of local authorities working closely with other local stakeholders and communities. And there's a lot of sectors which are sensitive to climate, but also the deficit of funding, which we can see in terms of development and regular transfer, and particularly when we talk about adaptation. These local authorities and local stakeholders who've been part of the dialogue here, facing the fact that climate funding is mainly centralized. And there's a lot of requirements in terms of capacity building. So those are the challenges, but also opportunities that this mechanism can address. So we work with countries to help them at a central level, but also with local authorities so they can access and use this climate funding. We work on integrating climate questions in the planning and budgeting at a local level, and the instrument at the heart of this mechanism is called Grant for Climate Funding Based on Resilience. So it's results-based financing based on the Green Fund, which enables us to guarantee the programming for expenditure at a local level for adaptation. And the principle of the mechanism is to use the systems in the country to align with those to make sure that we can bring this funding to the local authorities, starting with a limited number. And once the mechanism has been consolidated, can then access or lead funding to an increasing number of local authorities through a systemic approach which can be scaled up. So this funding circuit is very specific. We work with local authorities, but also with the centralized government. And we see at the entry point, this money, which enables to lead money to different sources. So it often starts by project funding, and then often co-funding by the countries as well. And we also work with accreditation of entities in charge of funding or funds for local authorities. We also work on accreditation with the Green Fund and also direct access. And another specific feature is this blue box, which is a formula that we use to allocate funding. So local government, we use this, and this takes into account different criteria, population, surface area, but also year on year, the performance of local government in relation to a number of criteria. So these authorities can access funding if they meet basic criteria to make sure we have trust and confidence for this fund over the years. If they don't meet these criteria, they will be temporarily taken out of the fund. And then every year, depending on a certain number of pre-established performance criteria, they treat adaptation issues for climate, but also good use of funds, good governance, and cross-cutting issues of gender, environment. And so each local authority receives a score in an annual performance review, and that is used to calculate the following year's amount. Because we have a system per country, so it's important that the central government also can manage this on its own eventually. So local authorities will also work with the menu. So these are discretionary grants allocated to adaptation, but they can be used through different sectors. So here's an example in Gambia. We can see the different sectors there, which cover issues of nature-based solution, agriculture, infrastructure, water and sanitation, according to local risks, which are assessed, and according to the priorities as well on a local level. So the mechanism came about 10 years ago in Asia, and from 2014 it was introduced in Africa. Countries go through different stages, particularly first stage, where everything you see there is tested on a small scale with maybe 5 local authorities, 3 or 4 or 5, to make sure everything works properly in terms of the circuit, the menu, access conditions, the performance criteria, and so on. And then they go to phase 2. So they start working with more than 5 local authorities, maybe 10, 13, 20, 72 in Bangladesh, so that we can consolidate the mechanism at a bigger scale. And then the country goes to phase 3, which is upscaling at a higher level, and where the country accesses the funding directly without going through intermediaries, without going through a co-funded project. And that's the case of Bhutan and Cambodia, alongside other countries. So you can see all the countries in blue, which are those which have asked for assistance to set up the mechanism. And we also work in a partnership with them. And sometimes it's through the Green Fund, sometimes it's bilaterally. And some countries work together towards access to the Green Fund. So the experience has been documented by different countries and has been reviewed and accepted by the group of experts of PMA and other bodies as a recognized methodology. We've talked about access to the Green Fund and direct access to this. So you don't. Some countries have been able to be accredited. Some entities in Asia, particularly, and we've worked with the FNEC in Benin, as well as countries like Mali and Niger. And what we do is we work with them to create concept notes so that they can gain direct access to the Green Fund, to bring money to local stakeholders at a national or regional level. So I'm going to stop there, but just to say that all the countries in the plan on the map, sorry, that I showed you, take part in the governance of the mechanism, and we meet once a year. A number of environmental ministers have decided to become ambassadors for the mechanism and have launched a ministerial declaration recently, and that includes a certain number of countries in Africa, Gambia, Burkina, Niger, Ivory Coast, Mozambique, and other countries as well that I haven't quoted here. So the aim was to meet this deficit of funding at a local level while supporting and drawing on country systems to help populations through these decentralized channels. Thank you very much for your attention, and I would be very happy to answer any questions you have. Thank you very much. So I'm going to leave Romain to look at the questions now. I have a comment and a question here. The first one is for Estelle Mercier. I don't know whether you can hear me. I imagine you can. Yes, I can. I can. I noted earlier on that you were very happy that you can increase the standards, whereas AFD already has very high standard. I'm going to play the devil's advocate here, but we need more direct access from local authorities. The African experience is significant here, and I've seen a lot of people who struggle with this. And that's an argument often. They say local authorities don't have the capacity, so don't have access. So I wondered whether sometimes, and I'd like you to be as frank as possible about this, are there not too exacting a standard sometimes for funding in terms of adaptation? Sometimes I feel the bar is set too high sometimes, and I wonder what your feeling was about this, particularly in relation to those people who aren't directly involved in the capacity building. Thank you, Mr. Soulager. I was talking about public development banks, just to clear that up, and not local authorities, because what we do in the AFD Club is support accreditation for those people who aren't accredited, and also access to funding to these national banks in the club in Latin America, in Africa, as I said, or in Asia. I'm going to try and show the positive side. We know that these standards are too high for a lot of institutions. That's a certitude. And that creates natural selection, which we might criticize. But financially, the Green Fund is not so well endowed. When it was recapitalized in 2019 to the initial level to about 10 billion, we think that 10 billion is a lot, but over 4 years, it's only 2.5 billion a year. It's very tiny amount in relation to the global requirements. So it cannot resolve everything. It can't fund all institutions, big ones, small ones, medium ones, those with standards, those without. So it's natural selection that takes place there. So we do encounter difficulties in terms of climate funding and implementing projects due to these procedures, which are sometimes contradictory. And the Green Fund can be made better. It used to be a lot more complicated than it was. It still is somewhat, but we've made progress. You're a great diplomat there. It's a great answer. You'll have a great career. So, joking aside, I think there are a lot of lessons to learn. And you can see in the amounts that we saw earlier on, given the issues, the sums are very small, and we've got a lot of progress to make. And we have another question for the last speaker, Sophie de Konik. How much money do you have? And you showed us the overall scheme, but what I'm interested in are the figures. How much do you have in your potential portfolio? Local initiative is funded up to 110 million Half of that has already been spent. So the funding, we have overall funding, which enables us to enter into new countries in terms of technical assistance. And in each country, particularly the latest generation, we work with governments and the partners in the country to mobilize partners which are interested in setting things up. So that was done at the beginning with the local authorities and with the finance ministries and the relevant local authorities. And we've been identifying sources of funding. So it's not UNCDF, which are going to activate pilots, but we can't help countries go to phase 2 or 3 unless we do it country by country. So we do it on a tailored basis in each country. So we have 500 million and we'll put 10 million each country. So we can mobilize partnerships through that in each new country for every country that requests support. At the moment, we supported every country that's made a request. So we work with them on their leadership to try and unite their efforts and encourage partners to use this new system. I hope that answers your question. Yes, thank you very much. You can also chat together if you want to. We don't necessarily have the time for everybody to speak today. So I'm going to hand over to Romain, who is going to try to summarize some of the questions which deserve to be asked. So there are a lot of questions about access to the green funding for local authorities. And Bardo's tried to answer those questions in the chat, so please don't hesitate to look at the answers. Would you like to add anything to that topic? Or is everything clear for you? Thank you, Romain. I just wanted to add to that.
Le Gcf va canaliser toujours ses sources à travers des entités, des institutions accréditées par les fonds.
We often use accredited entities or institutions.
Dans le chat, c'est
Try to clarify that in the chat, that the institutions and local authorities or any local organization benefits from this funding through partnerships with institutions which can channel funding. There are always local stakeholders, or almost always, involved in implementing a project, even if it's funded through international institutions. And that's what we do at the Gcf here. We try to check the quality of the project in relation to the commitment of the accredited institution is had with the beneficiary. We can speak in more detail if there's any other questions, or I can answer them in the chat as well. So for all of you, a lot of people were asking about having the presentations. They will all be available online within a few days. The time it just takes us to compile everything, but they'll all be available to you online. Another question, perhaps for Liane. Anne Baz was asking the question about whether with COVID, the situation of women in terms of access to funding has got worse or not. As we know, they are the cornerstone of food security and the climate change issues, particularly in the African context. Do you have any comments you'd like to make about that?
I think one can answer the question directly and indirectly. I think obviously we heard how difficult it is to get access to climate finance for women's group. So on that part, it certainly hasn't gotten any easier, although I would wish that a lot of the projects and programs that are conceived right now take a broader stance on what, for example, adaptation means. We have discussions about climate rationality. You know, the moderator talked about how we don't want to make things more difficult. So discourses actually that need to show a clear adaptation linkage and, for example, do not support social system financing is something that hurts women particularly. So this is something that should be considered in ongoing adaptation financing. And then there is a larger overall issue there, how women get hurt. And that is if financing is increasingly provided in the form of loans and not in the form of grants, because that actually means that countries have less opportunity to invest in the activities on the ground that, for example, take off some of the care burdens that women have by strengthening social support systems. So again, there's an overall question, there is the direct question, but we should not lose sight of the fact that providing climate finance in the form of grants, particularly for adaptation, and particularly as full cost grants, not making a differentiation between, you know, what is the development baseline and what is the additional cost for adaptation is actually very much increasing access to the resources needed and for the activities needed for women. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Pardon. Peut-être une question.
Maybe a question, an open question now, because we have donors around the table here. So I'm not going to address anyone in particular here, but maybe a question we could raise here is how civil society organizations are organized, what type of organization would make things easier for international donors so that these stakeholders can get hold of funding. Are there any examples of types of networks being set up that work and that for an international donor make things easier? Would anybody like to answer this question, which I'm sure you've been asked before? Would anybody like to answer this question? Sophie? I'm going to try to. So we're not really a donor. We make access to funding easy, and we work with on a bilateral level with the Green Fund. This type of local mechanism offers a way of federating and uniting our work. Bhutan was the first country to start 10 years ago, and we have 100 local authorities, half the country. So little by little, we moved to Benin. We've got the project which has been developed, and we're going to aim to work with 30 local authorities, 30 areas. So it's about a third of the country. So it's a way of building other approaches which are more local authority by local authority to inform the type or the menu of investment, which I talked about earlier. It's not to say that it's better than a different kind of approach, but it can be used subsequently to other approaches which go local authority by local authority. There will always be bigger scale projects. And there's two different approaches which can be complementary. So it's one tool amongst many. But in terms of private stakeholders, there's a question earlier on about this, but we work mainly with market approaches. We work with funding service providers to help understand this client segment better, to help them develop new products and to go to places they didn't go to before, to serve types of private players they didn't serve before. So we try to have this type of approach so that we can use them more to have economies of scale. And that can follow on from more targeted work on a more limited scale. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. I think we've arrived at the end of this very interesting debate now. I really wanted to thank all the speakers because it has raised a lot of questions and requests, very specific ones. And I'd like to thank all the speakers to follow these up. So the idea is this is not just a one-shot event, but discussions continue and it can be useful for those people who do have questions. And you can see in the chat, there have been very many questions. We can't answer them all, but thank you very much for all your efforts in advance for answering these questions. I also wanted to say to donors, from a political perspective, I was in the regional authorities for 30 years, and the last job I did was managing the European funds for a French region. And in 5 years, I didn't manage to understand all the different financial mechanisms. But I've done long years of studies. I've got a lot of experience, but it was hugely complicated. I had a few people in my department who understood it, but I really felt a lot of the time that it was much too complicated. And listening to you, we're trying to be specific, but sometimes I put myself in the place of local elected representatives, and they say, well, I've got a project, how am I going to fund it? We can't do just anything, but I wanted to just share this feeling that I always feel, not just in Africa, but it can be just as true in France. With all the means of a French region, access to funding for these major issues and complicated issues can be difficult. And I thought your presentations were very clear. And if you can send on this message that we're in a chat with 200 people, so everybody's asking for easier access. And I think this is a great message to pass across to everybody. So thank you very much to you all, to all the participants. We'll be back in 50 minutes at 2 p.m. African time, 4 p.m. French time. And Romain will remind you of how we will continue our afternoon. So please don't hesitate to go to our website, have a look at the program from now, as well as tomorrow. We have parallel sessions going on, so you'll have to make a choice. The two next sessions on focus session on the role of women in climate action, alongside a workshop on the Sustainable Cities Coalition. And then later on, we'll have a focus group on decentralized corporations for climate, alongside a workshop on education and training on climate change. So thank you very much for being here, and we'll see you later for the next session. And have a nice meal for those of you who haven't eaten yet.